Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff Brown, and I work on the core Grails development team at OCI. So hopefully by now everyone has heard the news that OCI is the new home of the Grails framework, and I couldn't be happier to be there. OCI is fully committed to moving the technology forward, and we're really excited about that. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about that right now, because I know most of you have heard that spiel at least a couple of times over the last couple of days. But certainly if you have any questions at all about OCI or what we're doing with the technology, please come see me at the table or see me after this session and let me know, and I'll be happy to talk to you about anything at all that we might be able to help you with. But let's just press on and get right into it. So I want to talk about REST support in Grails 3, get a sense for what kind of a typical REST application looks like in Grails 3. And for those of you who were sat in on the microservices talk that I gave yesterday, there's a good bit of overlap between a lot of the material I'm going to cover today. I covered yesterday as well. And if you feel like you don't want to hear a lot of that again and want to flee the scene right now and grab something else, that's not a problem. You're not going to offend me. But there is going to be a little bit of overlap between what I covered yesterday and what I'm going to cover today. So let's get right into it. So one, REST is an architectural style. It's not a piece of software. It's not a library. It's kind of a way of doing things more than anything else. And I'm going to talk about the details, some of the details in the framework that relate to building those kinds of applications. It turns out that Grails is really quite well suited for building for publishing REST services. Also for consuming REST services, but in particular, there's a lot of support for publishing, for simplifying the process of publishing REST services. So part of the good news about that is that more and more folks want to build those kinds of applications, right? More and more folks want to build single page apps with maybe Angular on the front end or Ember. And need a REST backend for that. Folks are building out microservice architectures where you've got lots of small pieces of the puzzle spread around the data center, all publishing and consuming REST services from each other. REST is an important part of how we're building applications. Grails has fantastic support for REST, and we're going to talk about some of the specific features related to that. So Grails has always supported REST, right? REST is just it's an architectural style. So from the very beginning in Grails 0.3, you could build REST applications. But over the years, the framework has evolved and changed in a lot of ways to adapt to the ways that folks want to build applications now in the next year or two ahead of us. And the REST support has gotten significantly better over the years because REST is so much more important today than it was 6 or 7 years ago when a lot of this technology was first emerging. So we're going to look at some of the really cool stuff that Grails has to offer for building those kinds of applications. We'll talk about URL mappings and data binding and some really interesting stuff that's going on inside of your controllers, code that you never see, but a bunch of code that we generate on your behalf that relates to data binding and publishing REST services. And then that kind of overlaps with some of the stuff we can do with domain classes as resources. And so typically these REST applications receive requests that have a body to them. The body could be XML or JSON or any number of formats. And the framework can, on your behalf, without you having to write much code, the framework can parse the body of the request, can recognize what format the body is in, can parse the body, and then carry out some really sophisticated data binding. So you can turn the body of a request that contains a bunch of JSON into a graph of objects very easily, and the other way around works as well. You can take a graph of objects and pretty easily serialize them into JSON to make that the response. So we're going to take a look at what a lot of that looks like inside the framework. So here's just a standard, really simple, hello worldy kind of domain class in a Grails application. So of course this would be defined under Grails-app/domain. We've got a class that declares some properties, and so that's a perfectly valid domain class, just like it is. Without any additional code, that's a perfectly valid domain class. If I had a URL mapping that looks something like this, what this says is all requests to /people and anything below /people will be handled by the person controller. And this table details that a little bit more. And this is an example that I covered in a good bit of detail yesterday. So with a URL mapping like that in place, a whole bunch of URL mappings are created, right? You just type the line that's up at the top and all these mappings get created. And those mappings are consistent with standard patterns for how people want to publish REST services. So the same URL is used numerous times in some cases. So notice the last two there are both /people/ID. So that could be /people/9. And if you send a put request to /people/9, that will update the person whose ID is 9. And if you send a delete request to /people/9, that's a request to delete that person. So there are URL mappings that map the same URL to different behaviors based on the HTTP verb. And the HTTP verb is very important in REST services. A get means something, and a post, and a put, and a delete. All those verbs have meaning within the context of REST. And Grails is leveraging those conventions to generate these rules for you, where you only type the one line of code, which you see at the top, and then we create all these mappings for you. So since very early versions of Grails, I don't remember when this was introduced, but it was introduced very early, you could define a URL mapping. So the normal thing when you define a URL mapping is you define a URI, and then you specify which controller and which action in that controller should be invoked anytime a request comes into that URI. You could start making that a little more RESTful by, instead of specifying that the action should be a string, so you'd say action equals index or action equals create. Instead of specifying a URL mapping like that, you could say action equals map, a map. And the keys in the map would be HTTP verbs like get, put, post, and delete. And the values associated with those keys would be action names. So normally you would say action equals save or action equals show. But instead you could say action equals map, again, where the keys are these verbs and the values associated with those keys are actions. So that's a way to create this kind of mapping that's been supported in Grails all along. We've just simplified that and made it a little bit more powerful and more flexible with what you see here, right? So /people is all I have to specify in my URL mappings file, and then all these URL mappings get created on your behalf. So now I can send requests to the application that looks something like this, right? So if I want to retrieve, remember my URL mapping is /people, I want to retrieve a JSON representation of all of the people that are in the system. So that first curl command there will do that. I'm sending a request to /people, and I'm specifying an accept header that indicates what I would like how I would like the response formatted. So if I change that accept header to application/XML, then I'll get XML back. As written, I'll get JSON back, right? I can create a person using the command you see below. So I'm sending the request to the same URL, right, /people, but the HTTP verb is different. By default, curl is going to generate a GET request. So the first curl command is going to be a GET request. The second curl command, I'm being explicit. I'm saying make this a POST request. I'm adding a header that specifies that the content type is application/JSON. That's important because the server needs to know what format the body of the request is in, and that content type header is how that's expressed. The second header being expressed there is the accept header. That indicates what type of response I want. Or how I want the response formatted. And in this case, I'm saying I want JSON back. The -d is curl's argument for specifying the body of the request. So this is a POST request. The content type is application JSON, and the body is what you see after the -d there. So it's a JSON map with a couple of three keys, first name, last name, and age, and the values associated with those keys are Jake, Brown, and 14, just like you see there. And then the last part of the command is just the URL, right? So again, notice that those requests are going to the same URL, the exact same URL, but because the one is a GET and one is a POST, fundamentally different things are going to happen with those requests. It's all standard REST stuff. Grails is just making it really easy to get that all in place. And then finally, the update person command is kind of more of the same there, but we're using a put request instead of a get or a post. And notice the URL is different. So at the very bottom of the slide there, you see the URL is /people/1. And that 1 represents the ID of the person that I want to update. So notice when I created the person, his name was Jake. And then later I want to update him and make his name Jacob. So we see at the top, we're retrieving people. In the middle, we're creating a person. And at the bottom, we're updating an existing person. All that can be made to work by writing just a domain class that looks like this. Generating the default scaffolding is one way. It can be made even more simple than that. But what we're talking about now is you've written this, generated the default scaffolding, and typed this into your URL mappings file. That's all the code you've written. Then all this kind of stuff will work, right? All these mappings are in place. And that will support requests like these. Right? Does all that make sense? Are there any questions about any of that? I see thumbs in the air. That's a good sign. All right, let's get some. Let me introduce another idea, and then we'll get some code in place. A couple more ideas. Stop that. All right. All right, so inside of a controller, Grails developers know the way to author controller actions is you declare a public method inside of your controller action that returns, typically you would use the def keyword, but it has to return object and can accept any number of arguments. In this case, the controller action accepts one argument, and the argument is of type person. So this is the update action in a controller. This is the intent of this controller action is to update something in the database. And it's important that when you're building web applications that you not do things like mutate the database in response to a GET request. So for example, if you could send a request to your application to a URL like /people/delete/4, people/delete/4, and what that's going to do is delete the person whose ID is 4. You should never do that in response to a GET request. That's a terrible idea, right? So what if Google cached that link and somebody does a search for your stuff and they click the link on the Google search results? That's going to generate a GET request, and now they've just deleted data just by clicking a link, right? There are good reasons that you don't want to do destructive things in response to a GET request. So it's important that in your controller action, you've got some kind of logic that makes sure that that's being respected. So this says if the request method is not a put, send a 405 back to the client. Don't allow this to happen. We're going to send an error. And then in the else block is where the update would take place. So that's tedious. You don't want to have to write that code. In very, very early versions of Grails, like before 0.3, that's what you would have to do, right? So that was showing up in lots and lots of places. Any controller action that was doing destructive stuff, if it was responsible code, should have been doing this, right? You want to make sure that you're not doing destructive things in response to a GET request, as an example. So don't do that. You want that logic in place, but you don't want to have to write that code. And the allowed methods property that Grails supports imposes that for you. So instead of having that imperative logic show up in pretty much most of your controller actions, instead of that, you can declare this allowed methods property in any controller. And the way the allowed methods property works is the value that you're assigning to that property is a map. The keys in the map correspond to action names, and the values associated with those keys correspond to the verbs that are valid for accessing that particular controller action. So in this particular case, what's being expressed is the save action is only accessible via a post request, the update action is only accessible via a put, and the delete action is only accessible via a delete request. And then inside of the update action, you ignore that fact. Just put code in your update action that should happen when the update action is invoked. And having the allowed methods thing there makes sure that no request will ever make its way into your update action if it's not a put request. Yes?
And the controller methods that are explicitly mentioned there what is involved?
Yeah, the question is, so what happens to controller actions that are not represented in the allowed methods property? And it's a good question. And no restrictions are imposed on them. So not every controller action needs to be represented here because not every controller action is going to do something destructive. I never put anything in here with a GET request. I don't care. Why would I express that? You could. But the only things that I want to, that generally I'll add to the allowed methods property are the things that need to be restricted. So anything not represented there is not restricted. There was another hand, yes?
So would someone get a 405 then if they did it again?
They would, yeah. The question is, what would happen if a controller action is represented in the map and a request comes in that violates what's expressed here? So for example, what would happen if a GET request was sent to the update action? And the answer is you'll get a 405.
Don't the W3 requirements say that you're supposed to say what's allowed in the header when you send it 405?
The question is, does the W3C spec say that you're supposed to express what's supposed to be allowed in the header when you generate a 405? You say you think it is? Yeah, and I don't know the answer to that, but we're not doing that. We're not populating the response header. That might be a good idea, though. But the framework doesn't do that for you. Yeah?
So you only write in methods in this controller that are going to be acting as services, endpoints, right? Otherwise, you make them private.
So the question or the comment is you would only be defining methods in your controller that should be endpoints. And that's not true. There are times when you want to define methods that are not endpoints. So for example, the declarative exception handling that we added in 2.2 or 2.3, that's a good reason to declare public methods in your controller actions, in your controllers that are not controller actions. They're error handling methods. Generally, you don't want to put public methods in your controller action, in your controllers that are not controller actions, but what I just described as an example is an exception to that.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that, for example, instead of update, we have update 2.
Okay?
And it's not mentioned in the allowed methods. So someone can press a link with update 2 and then probably put 9 or something like that, for example. And then, so this is not supposed to be a REST method, yet now it's being accessed.
Yeah, so it's the comment suggests what if we have an update action, and then in addition to that we have an update 2 action. So the fact that it's update 2 doesn't matter. It's just some other action. It's an action that's not represented in allowed methods. If that action needs to be restricted, then represent it in the allowed methods thing. And if it doesn't need to be restricted, then it's a non-issue, right? But another thing that factors in here is even if you did have public methods in your controller that are not actions, you shouldn't do that. But even if you did, the user can't get to them unless you provide a corresponding URL mapping for them. So, and the default URL mapping that's created, this is worth mentioning here. Where is it? Here we go. So this is the default URL mappings file that's created for a Grails application. I haven't edited this. I haven't modified it. This is what's there from the beginning. So you created a new app. This is what's there. This guy demos really well, and it's handy in the early phases of development. But for real application development, I suggest that you delete this. You generally don't want that there in a real application. And the reason that you may not want that there is it exposes. It's an open door to some extent to your application. What this says is if someone can guess or someone knows the name of a controller and the name of an action, they can just type that into a URL and go, right? And generally, you don't want to open that up. If the rest of the application is well written, then this won't necessarily represent a real problem because you've got all the necessary guards in place elsewhere. So this demo's well, and it's convenient, and I'm glad that it's there. I'm not advocating that we stop generating that, but it's important that you understand the implications of having that there. And that is, if you were to put a public method in a controller and didn't intend for it to be an action, and someone somehow figures out that name or just is guessing names, this mapping will provide access to it. So now I can just generate a request and execute whatever code is in that method. Does that make sense? Yep. Yeah. So allowed methods, make sure you're thinking about allowed methods when, as you're writing controller actions. It's a very simple thing. There's really not much complexity here, but you don't want to forget about it. Otherwise, if you do forget about it, now you're leaving, you'll be allowing GET requests to do things that you shouldn't be able to do with a GET request. So keep that in mind. So data binding. So if you write a controller action that looks like the code on top, right? You write a method called someControllerAction that accepts a widget as an argument. The compiler will generate this other method for you. The code at the top is what you write, and the code at the bottom is what the compiler generates for you. And it's, as the comment there says, this is a little bit pseudocodey just to keep the thing sort of manageable on a slide. But this is basically what the compiler will generate for you. So at compile time, we recognize that you've got a controller action that accepts a widget as an argument. So all of your controller actions need to be zero argument methods. You can author them as if they have arguments, but the one at the bottom is the one that's actually treated by the framework as the controller action. So the part, Grails is never going to call that method at the top. You wrote the method and the code in it gets executed, but Grails doesn't call that. Grails will always call the no argument method, and notice the very last line in the no argument method is calling the version that you wrote. So if you were to put a breakpoint in your code at the method at the top, you would see that Grails is never calling it. The code inside of your controller is calling it. You just didn't write the code in your controller. We're generating that for you. So what the generated method does is the compiler recognizes that you've defined a controller action that accepts a widget as an argument. So we know we need to pass a widget into your controller action as an argument. So we create an instance of the widget class, impose that thing, subject that thing to data binding. So the request parameters will be bound to that widget instance. Then the widget is subjected to dependency injection. So if there are spring beans that need to make their way into that widget, that'll happen. As the comment says, that code's omitted here, but that does happen. Then the thing is validated, the widget is validated, and that only happens if the widget is validatable. It could be the case that widget is not validatable, so the compiler is smart enough to figure that out and not try to validate the thing if it's not validatable. So it's created, data binding happens, then DI happens, then the thing is validated, and then it's passed into the controller action that you wrote. So by the time your code executes, all that stuff's already happened and the widget is already validated. So often I'll see code where the very first line inside of some controller action there is w.validate, and there's no good reason to do that. We've already validated the thing for you, so you're just validating it twice. So a more reasonable thing to do would be the first thing inside of some controller action is check to see if W has errors. Right? You validated it and you want to know if it's valid. Check to see if it has errors. Right? So the compiler is generating all this stuff at the bottom. If the argument type, if the widget class, or in this case the person class, is a domain class, then a bunch of other additional special stuff happens. And this is, again, this is pseudocode, but stepping through this will help us understand basically what's going on. So let's say the person class is a domain class, and you've written a controller action that accepts a person as an argument. So the compiler is going to generate the no argument method, just like I described before. It's going to check to see if there is a params.id, and if there is, we'll send a query to the database to retrieve the person whose ID is that value. So that's the p equals person.get params.id. If there's not an ID request parameter and the request method is a post, then a new person is created. So we're only going to create a new person if this is a post request, right? So that's the code on the left, right? If there's a params ID, then we use that to go retrieve a person from the database. If there's not a params ID, a params.id, then if this is a post request, then we'll create a brand new person. So next, we fall over to the code on the right. We need to figure out whether or not this thing should be subjected to data binding. So we'll initialize do binding to true, and then under certain circumstances, we'll initialize it to false. So the first thing we check is there a params.id? What we're really trying to do is make sure that a persistent entity is not updated when it shouldn't be, right? So we're only concerned, we'll always do data binding if it's not a persistent entity. So only if params.id exists are we concerned with any of this. So if params.id does exist, then we'll check to see if this is a patch, post, or put request. And if it is a patch, post, or put request, then we're going to turn off, is that right? Yeah, oh, there's a not in front of that. If it's not a patch, post, or put request, then we're going to turn off data binding. So you can't send, even if this controller action is accessible via a get, for example, you can't send a get request to this controller action and put some request parameters out there and kind of sneak some data into the system through the built-in data binding system. Data binding is going to be turned off unless printed off for this domain class unless the request is a patch post or put request. Does that make sense? Right, so then we fall through towards the bottom there and check to see if do binding is still true. Let's go ahead and do the data binding. Then from there out, it's the same, right? Dependency injection is imposed on the thing, then it's validated, and then we call your code. All that's happening before any of your code even executes, right? Your code's up at the top, and all this stuff takes place before your code gets invoked. Right? Yeah.
Does that mean there's no opportunity here to exclude params?
The question is, does that mean that there's no opportunity here to exclude params? And it does not mean that. This is a little bit pseudocodey. So if we were in RestfulController, for example, there's a method you can override from the RestfulController parent class where you get to dictate what the binding source will be. All this stuff will still happen, but instead of just params, it's the thing that you defined. So there's more to that, and I'll be happy to drill into that with you offline if we want. But this doesn't mean that you are giving up control over what gets data bound. Other comments or questions about this? Yeah, all right. All right, so all of that we've talked about so far involves controllers that you've written. There's some pretty sophisticated REST stuff supported by the framework without having to author a controller at all. So you can create a domain class and annotate it with @resource. And what you're doing when you annotate a domain class with @resource is you're expressing to the framework that this entity, the car class, should be managed as a REST resource. And in this case, I want all cars to be accessible under the /automobiles URI. So let's jump into the IDE here and have some fun maybe. All right, so I'm gonna create a Groovy class that I'll call person. All right. This project is empty, by the way, other than this class that I just wrote. There's no other, Grails create app is all that's taken place so far. So I've got a simple domain class called person that has a couple of properties in it, and I want to annotate this thing with grails.rest.resource. I want to say something like that. That looks good. All right, so I've defined my domain class, and I've specified that this thing is a REST resource. That's what the @resource annotation does. I've specified the URI where these things are accessible, and I've specified the formats that are supported here. With just that, I'm not going to write any more code right now. I'm just going to start the application up. By the way, right now I'm using IDEA. I happen to be using the Ultimate Edition right now, but I'm not taking advantage of any Ultimate Edition features. What I'm doing here would work just as well in the Community Edition. And in particular, what I'm getting at is I can just open this application class and run it. I pressed the keyboard shortcut to do this, but that's what I did right there. Run the application main. So without any Grails smarts at all in the IDE, I can operate, I can get around and do quite a bit with a Grails 3 application, which was not the case with Grails 2. Because of how we're using Spring Boot and the fact that we're using Gradle as the build system in Grails 3, that really changes the story with the IDE quite a bit. So as I said, I happen to have the Ultimate Edition up and running right now, but what I just did would work just as well in Community Edition with no Grails support at all. And that is, I can start the application up, I can put breakpoints and do step debugging, and all that stuff just works really, really well. All right, so our application is up and running. I've got a couple of curl commands I'm going to copy and paste here. So let's send that request to the application. So I'm sending a GET request to /people, and there are no people in the system, so I'm getting back basically an empty collection there. There are no people. So let's send another request to create a person. Right? So this is a post request. The content type is JSON. This is the body of the request. Let me see if I can get this to fit. I guess that's it. This is the body of the request, right? It's some JSON that has a first name and a last name in it. And I'm sending the request to the same URL that I sent the first request to, but this is a post request, right? So this should create a new person. And it looks like it did. So let's go back to the first request. So we see the body of the request this time is not an empty list. It's a list that has one map in it, and that map represents the person that I just created, Jeff Brown. Let's create another person. I'm just going to edit the body of this request and create Betsy Brown. Right? That looks like that worked. Let's send another request. So the output there is a little hard to parse, but you can see that Jeff Brown is there and Betsy Brown is there. So I can continue creating people, and so what we see so far is that by just defining the domain class and annotating it with @resource and specifying a couple attributes in the @resource annotation, we really do have a fully functioning REST API here. All those URL mappings that we saw in that green table with the gets and puts and posts, all that stuff works. That's all very, very slick with very little effort. And then one more thing we can do is, so this is sending a put request to, so this is a put request to /people/1. And 1 happens to be the ID of Jeff because he was the first person that I created. And notice that I'm changing his first name to be Jeffrey, right? So the body of the request only contains the information that I want to update, that is the first name. And the body doesn't even include the ID, right? So how does the system know which entity to update? And the answer is this last part of the URI there. That number 1 indicates the ID of the thing that I want to update with this information, right? So we'll go ahead and send that request. It looks like it worked. Let's go back to the first request. And now we see Jeff's name is Jeffrey, right? And I can send a delete request and delete a guy. And so we've got full CRUD capabilities around our person class. I'm trying to get here. We've got full CRUD capability around this thing with just the code that you see there right now. So, questions about any of that? Yeah.
Profile you used to create this project would be web API?
The question is, what profile did I use to create this application? And the profile is the default web profile. This is a full web application with GSP support and all of that. I'm not taking advantage of any of the new REST profile stuff that's in development right now. This is a standard Grails 3 web app. I'm just not using any of the web features other than the REST stuff that we're talking about. Yeah?
With that resource annotation, does the mapping report then include that particular resource?
Yeah, the question is, will the URL mapping report include those URL mappings? And it's a good question. Let me see where T-rest it. That's where I want to get. I want to show you what that looks like. Is it URL mappings report or mapping? Is it mapping singular? All right. The answer is it does include that, but I want to show you what that looks like. So I've got some unresolved dependencies that have to be downloaded now. Apparently I've not run a URL mappings report with this version of Grails in this machine. I don't think that's going to take terribly long, but that will eventually run to completion, and we will have a URL mappings report, and those URL mappings that we saw that I described should be represented in that report. There we go. All right. Yeah. So here they are. People create, people something edit, people. So those are represented in the URL mapping report, which is good. That is what you're talking about, right? Yeah, very good. Any other questions about this? Yeah.
Just one quick one.
Sure.
If you would happen to send a put request with like an empty payload, would it go and process it? Would it update like some of those pseudo columns, like the updated date, or would it just ignore that altogether?
Yeah, so the question is, if you sent a put request to update an object and nothing was updated, would the auto timestamp things like last updated be updated? And I think the answer is no, because the object won't be dirty, so it won't be saved. I'm pretty sure that's what will happen. All right, let's press on. Yeah, so with that @resource annotation in place, we get all the same URL mappings that we would have gotten. All these things are in place, right? We don't have to generate a controller. We don't have to write a class that extends RESTful controller. We don't have to do anything at all with a controller. All of that will happen automatically because we annotated our domain class with that resource. So we get the same URL mapping, same controller behavior, same data binding, all the same rendering stuff, which we're going to talk more about next or soon. We just don't have to write a controller or do anything at all with URL mappings. Notice that I didn't go into URL mappings and do that, right? I didn't have to say slash people or slash people resources in my URL mappings. That happens automatically because of the value that I assigned to the URI attribute of grails.rest.resource. All right, so let's talk about responding to requests. So now we're into the territory where you are writing a controller. In the sample that I just did, there is no controller. At least we don't have one in source file format. But when you are writing a controller, often you want to be able to respond to different requests. You want to be able to generate responses with different formats, right? So for example, we might have one format for the browser, one format that represents whatever this data is in XML form, and another in JSON form. So for a long time, Grails has supported this with format method inside of your controller actions. And the way it works is you can call with format and then pass a closure as an argument. And then inside of that closure, you can invoke methods like HTML, XML, and JSON. And those names, those method names, correspond to MIME types that can be configured here. So grails.mime.types, these keys right here, Atom, CSS, CSV, form, HTML, JSON, those keys correspond to the method names that you can use here. So if a request comes into the application with that is expecting application/JSON in the response, that's the accept header. That's the value of the accept header as part of this request. This key can be used as in that with format block that we just described. And the way that Grails gets to that key is it knows that this is the accept header, application/JSON. So it knows that that's kind of the label that's associated with application/JSON. That's the name you can use inside of this with format block. So we're calling with format. We're saying we've got some data and we're ready to generate a response. And I want different response for different kinds of accept headers. If the accept header is HTML, then I just want to return a map. So when a controller action returns a map, what will happen is the framework will render a view by convention. And the convention is that the view that's rendered, its name will match this controller action name. So in this case, the controller action is called list. So when that first line inside the with format block, the one that says HTML space and some code, when that executes, a map is returned, and that'll cause the list.gsp to be rendered, and this map represents the model that will be available inside the GSP. So inside the GSP, if I refer to the person list variable, the value of that person list variable is whatever was returned from person.list up at the top, right? If this were, if we're generating an XML response, so if the accept header was application/XML as an example, then the XML block gets executed, and we're rendering people as XML. So we'll talk more about converters here in just a minute, but that's a way to represent a list of something as XML. You can say render list as XML. You end up with an XML representation of the data in that list. Likewise, we've got JSON. So that support has been there for some time. In recent versions of Grails, the respond method is preferred because it's less code and it's a little bit more flexible. So the show method could look just like this, right? So I just call respond and pass a person as an argument. And the respond method will do some of the same stuff that you could have expressed in the with format block. And that is it'll look at the accept header, and there's another piece of this that you can specify a format in your URL mapping. So a request can be sent to something like /people/1.json or people/1.xml. And that thing after the dot there ends up representing the MIME type that you want, that describes how the response should be formatted. The respond method takes advantage of all that stuff. So you've got very, very little code in your controller action that relates to that content negotiation stuff. Dave?
The caller wouldn't need to use the dot something, right? They could just use
The question is, does the caller need to use the dot thing, or could it use the regular accept header? And the answer is the accept header is really not reliable. The answer is no. The caller does need to use the dot, depending on how you've set up your URL mappings. The problem with relying on the accept header is browsers will generate a request where the accept header is application/JSON/text/ or comma text/HTML. So we can't rely on, I don't know why that is, but I know that it is, but we can't rely on that accept header. It works in curl because, so in curl when I was specifying the accept header, Grails will respect the accept header from a curl request, because it's not that it's accepting curl, it's that it's blacklisting pretty much every browser you might use. Let me see if I can quickly find that.
But if it was another application that was calling it, and you're using code to call, the REST client type thing.
Yeah, I want to see the list of, there's a specific list of user agents that we ignore the accept header for. And if I can quickly find it, we'll look, there it is right there. This is what I was looking for. Yeah, so if the user agent matches this, then the accept header, respecting that the accept header is turned off. And that, can you guys even see that? Yeah, okay. Gecko, WebKit, Presto, Trident, that's pretty much any browser you might be using, right? So the accept header is ignored for all of those.
That's for browsers, but if it's another application calling, like, I'm thinking of the separate service applications that we were talking about yesterday.
As long as the user agent doesn't match that, then the accept header will be respected, which is why it works for curl requests, because the curl request will not have a user agent that matches that regular expression. Yep. So yeah, so if you're publishing a REST service and an application is calling this REST service, then in a case like that, the caller should express the accept header, and it'll be respected, as long as one of those, as I said, as long as the user agent doesn't match one of those that we just looked at. Does that make sense? Other questions or comments about any of that? It's good stuff. Very little code in your application and lots of flexibility and good stuff happening in the application. So when you do that, so if a request comes in for to retrieve a person, and the request is expressed that we want the person back in JSON format, the default JSON representation is something like what you see over here, right? When we were sending these requests to the application earlier, we see how persons are represented by default in JSON. We get that. But it may be the case that you want to customize that JSON for some reason. You want to add additional attributes, or you want to customize the JSON for some reason. And there are a number of pieces of this that are quite simple, but you've got a lot of flexibility around some of that. So one thing you could do is you can register the renderer. You can register a bean in the Spring application context that is the renderer for a particular type, and then do things like you see here. So what's being expressed here is we're registering a JSON collection renderer for person. So anytime a collection of person objects is being rendered as JSON, this is the bean that will be used to render that collection of person objects. So it'll be an instance of JSON collection renderer. And what's being expressed here is I want to exclude the age attribute. So if person has first name, last name, and age, with this in place, when a collection of person objects is rendered as JSON, we'll get JSON that looks just like this. And notice there is no age attribute here because I didn't have an age attribute in my model. But if I did have an age attribute in my model, it would be represented here unless I did something like this. This is saying don't include the age in the JSON that's generated. Does that make sense? Right? So that's a very, very simple kind of customization. We're just excluding properties there. So now when I send requests to the application to ask for all the people, we'll get all the people that are in the system, but the age is not represented. And again, this is, in this case, the person class does have an age property. It's just not represented in the JSON because we've excluded it. Make sense? Maybe you want to write a custom renderer and take total control over what's being generated. So back here, all we did was we controlled what was being generated just by excluding some properties or excluding a property, the age property. Maybe we want to get more involved and take more fine-grained control over what's being generated. So here we've written a class called person XML renderer. So this thing will be used anytime I need to render a person as XML. This class extends abstract renderer, which is a genericized type. So notice it says person XML renderer extends abstract renderer of person, and so that person generic there will end up being the first argument to this render method. So in the constructor, you need to call the superclass constructor and specify two things. The first is the type that this renderer is for. This is for person objects. And the second argument is an array of MIME type objects that represents which MIME types this renderer corresponds to. So the fact that the renderer is called XML renderer is just for the humans. That name doesn't mean anything special to the framework. The way the framework knows what types this thing is associated with is that second argument that you're passing to the superclass constructor there. So in this case, MIME type.xml and MIME type.text.xml are the MIME types that this particular renderer will be used for. And we need to override the render method that we inherit. I believe it's abstract in abstract renderer, but we need to implement this render method, and the render method accepts two parameters. The first parameter is the thing being rendered, so a person object, and the second argument is a render context. And a common thing to do with that render context is to retrieve the writer from it, and it's a java.io.writer, and write whatever you want to write to that writer. So this renderer gets to put whatever it wants in the writer. In this case, we want to put markup. We want to write markup to the writer. So we're creating a groovy.xml.markup builder and passing context.writer as an argument to that constructor. So now when I interact with that markup builder, whatever the markup builder generates will be written to context.writer, right? So in this case, what are we doing? So it looks like the person class has properties called age, first name, and last name. And in the XML, instead of the word age, I want to see the word years old. Instead of first name, I want to see the word first. And instead of last name, I want to see the word last. But I get to dictate exactly what the XML is going to look like here, right? The question is, do you have access to other parameters that might be coming out of the request? And I don't think if we did, it would be through render context, and I think the answer is no. What do we have access to here? Yeah, not the request or the request parameters. Yeah. So you can tell from looking at this code sort of the context you're executing in. All you've got access to is the person in the context, and the context does not provide access to request parameters. So what is the use case that you were thinking about wanting access to the request?
In case they want to do some type of custom materializer where they want to specify on the request, give me these following pieces of other person.
Yeah, so you don't have access to that here. You could have a custom MIME type, and you could get there that way. So instead of MIME type.xml, you'd have your own MIME type or it wouldn't be MIME type but your own MIME type that dictates that it's XML and it's this kind of this particular flavor of XML that doesn't have the age attribute in it, as an example. So then you have different renderers for those different MIME types. Yeah, so if I rendered a person with that, so I need to register this in the Spring application context as a bean, and now anytime a person object is rendered as XML or text XML, this is the thing that'll be used to generate the XML. So this is that renderer being registered, right? The name of the bean doesn't mean anything, just needs to be a bean name. The type of the bean is what's important. The framework is going to find all the renderers in the context and put them in the pool that we reach into anytime we need to render, like when you call respond as an example. So the bean name is not important. The class name is not important. The type of the class is what's important. right? So now when I send a request, with that being in place, when I send the request to retrieve a particular person, this is the XML I get. Instead of age equals 16, we've got years old equals 16 and so forth. Questions about that? Yeah.
How would you do a collection of people?
The question is, how would you do a collection of people? And the answer is the same kind of thing here, except instead of extending abstract renderer, I think it's called abstract collection renderer. It's not. What is the name of the collection renderer, Graham? Where is? Container renderer. That sounds right.
We have that in our code.
You have container renderer in your code? Is that what you said? Yeah, so container renderer is the same sort of thing, but for a container of objects. Yeah, I couldn't remember the name of that class. Yeah.
And Jeff,
Yeah.
I gotta go look up my code, but I've got something where I'm using the request parameters in one of these.
In a renderer?
Yes, because I'm spitting them out. I'm spitting out the max and the offset when I'm rendering. I created a data section that has all the data, and then a metadata section that has the.
You might be, so there are ways you could get to the request from here. There are static holders that you can access the request. Does that sound like maybe something you might be doing?
I forget how I did it, but whoever asked that question, come see me after this, and I'll show you how we did it.
The design of this is that the renderer should be on one edge of the request. So that it can be used outside of the service API or in any context. You want to pass the render context to the model. And just like in your controller, you would set a responder passing out the model. Reading the values from the request and passing it in as the model. That way you get clean separation between the request, the controller, and the renderer.
That's how I did it.
Yeah, so I'll repeat some of this for the benefit of the recording, but what was described is that the renderer really shouldn't have any need to have access to the request or anything servlet related. It should have access to the thing being rendered and a place to put it. So in this case, the writer or this context is a place to write to. So if the renderer needed access to request parameters, then those request parameters should be put in the model that's being passed to the respond method as an argument. So you can get the information into the renderer, but it should be sent to the renderer as opposed to the renderer. The renderer shouldn't have access to any servlet related stuff. Okay, so that makes sense. Other comments about any of that? Yeah.
How does that relate to the default converter configuration that was in Grails 2?
How does that relate to the default converter configuration that was in Grails 2? So what are you referring to when you say the default named configs? So I'm not sure what we're talking about. I'm sorry, what did you say? What about them? Is that what you're asking about?
To declare different name configs for, let's say, being able to pass a parameter in for different renders based on a request.
You're talking about back, like when you call respond, passing.
Similar, but not quite the same.
So what might you be passing to the respond method that's relevant to the question?
It's a little bit different. I can talk to you about it after.
Okay. Good enough? I'd be happy to do that. I've got just a couple more things we'll cover here, and then we can open it up for QA and maybe wrap up. All right, so I've mentioned Restful Controller a few times. So if you wanted to, so a few things. One, we started with the idea that you could write a domain class, generate the default scaffolding, and then use the URL mapping that says something like /people resources : person, and then all those URL mappings are generated for you. So you're generating a default scaffolded controller in that scene. Another option is you can write a domain class and annotate that with that resource and never generate a controller. So there's no controller in your source code anywhere. And we demoed that and saw how that works. Another option you've got is you can write a class that extends Restful Controller, and when you do that, you inherit a bunch of a bunch of controller actions from Restful Controller that support all the common things that you might want to do in a REST controller. It's all the same behavior that you'll have when you're using the @resource annotation with no controller at all. So you're inheriting all those controller actions, but you can override any of them that are necessary. So if you wanted to change the way the show action works or the save action, you can do that. And there are several other methods in Restful Controller that you might want to override for various reasons. So for example, there's a method in Restful Controller called query for resource that accepts a serializable as an argument. And by default, what that query for resource method does is it calls, effectively it calls person.get and passes ID as an argument, and whatever's returned from that is returned from query for resource. But if you want to customize how that's done, you get to do that. So you can generate, you can override query for resource, and instead of calling super.query for resource, you can impose your own logic here. So for example, you can send a query to the database to retrieve the person that satisfies some criteria. And maybe it's more than just person.getID, right? If it was just person.getID, you wouldn't have to override this. Maybe you're going to look at other request parameters, or maybe you're going to look at a security context, or for whatever reason, you want to get involved in defining the query that will be used to go retrieve a person by ID. This is a way for you to do that. So you wouldn't never necessarily write code that calls this method. There are methods inside of Restful Controller that are calling this method, and you're overriding it to plug in your own custom behavior for whatever motivation, right? There are a number of places in Restful Controller where data binding needs to happen. So for example, when you're saving a newly created instance, data binding has to happen. When you're updating an existing instance, data binding has to happen. And by default, what happens is something like this. So inside of a controller, we can do this over here in real code. I just want a controller class. So let's say you had a demo controller and you wanted to update a person object. You could do, in fact, I'm going to leave that out to be explicit about a couple of things. So you could say def p equals person.get params.id, and then you'd have an if check to make sure that person exists and so forth. I'm going to skip the error checking here, and you could do something like that. So what that's going to do is retrieve a person from the database and then update that person. Is that visible? Okay, good. I see lots of thumbs up. Good enough. Here, let's do this. This will be a lot easier to look at. I'll just create a controller out here. There we go. Hopefully that's easier to look at. All right, so we've got a controller action that looks something like that. Right? All right, so we've retrieved an instance from the database, and I want to do data binding on that thing. If I do this, what will happen is params is a map, of course. It includes all the HTTP request parameters. So if there's if person has a class has a property called first name, and there's a request parameter called first name, the value of that request parameter will be bound to the corresponding property in the person object. Right? It's all kind of standard Grails and Gorm kind of stuff that most Grails developers are familiar with. But this won't work. The way this is written right now, that will not work if the intent, if the request has a body, and maybe the body of the request is a bunch of JSON, and that JSON represents what should be used to update this, this person. What you see there won't work, right? This is only going to, this is grabbing the request parameters in particular and using those as the binding source. Specifically, what's on the right-hand side of the equals on line 8 is the binding source. That's the data that's going to be used to instigate the data binding. More flexible way to do this is to use the request on the right-hand side of the equals there. And what will happen when you use the request on the right-hand side of the equals there is, and by the way, the same thing would happen if I did this. Right? I can do that. I can invoke the bind data method. If the request is used as the right-hand side or as the data binding source, there's a mechanism in the framework that will look at the request to see if it has a body. And if it does, the body will be parsed. So if it's JSON, we'll parse the JSON. If it's XML, we'll parse the XML. And that becomes the source of the data binding. So the body of the request has a bunch of JSON. The bind data method recognizes that the request has a body. The body is parsed, and that's the data binding source. This will also work if the request does not have a body. The framework, the bind data method will recognize that, and instead of using the body of the request as the binding source, the request parameters will be used, right? So rather than have a check here that says, does the request have a body? If yes, use the request, otherwise use the params. You can get rid of any kind of imperative logic like that that you might otherwise have written and just use the request as the right-hand side of the data binding request, and what I just said will happen. If the request has a body, that will be used, and if it doesn't, then request parameters will be used. And how that relates to this is by default, the getObjectToBind method returns the request. So whatever's returned from getObjectToBind, that's what's going to be used as the second argument to bind data in all of the default controller actions that you're inheriting from Restful Controller that do data binding. So you might override this as a way to participate in defining what is used as the right-hand side of the data binding. So as an example, maybe you want to exclude certain properties from data binding, properties that might be present as request parameters. So inside of getObjectToBind, you could create a map, put whatever you want in the map, and the things that you're putting in the map can come from anywhere, right? They can come from request parameters, or if you've got some other way to come up with this data. It doesn't matter how you gather the information, just whatever you return from getObjectToBind is what will be used as the second argument right here to bind data. So that's a way that you get to participate in helping define what the data binding source is. Does that make sense? Yeah. And there's another method. So we see query for resource here. There's a corresponding method for getting a list of resources. And I think it's called list resources. Yeah, list all resources. So there's a list all resources method that you can override, just like there is a, here, the example that we see here again just shows query for resources. So that query for resource. So this is the method that'll be called to retrieve a particular person, and there's another method for retrieving list of people, and you might override that for the same reasons, same kinds of reasons that you might override query for resource. Yep. Comments or questions about any of that stuff? Comments or questions about anything Grails or REST related? Anything at all I can help you with? Yeah?
Just a quick, this is more of a curiosity, but when we were doing this, I built a bunch of controllers, did not extend Restful Controller from the beginning, but went and did it later.
Okay.
And had to put all the constructors in. Is it possible just to use the inherit constructors annotation to do that instead?
When you're extending Restful Controller? No, inherits controller, what that will do is it will take all the constructors that are in your parent and override, yeah, I guess it would. No, because you don't want to have to pass a person class into your person controller constructor, right? You want to know our constructor that's going to pass the person class.
So it needs to be explicit.
Yeah, I think what happens when you use inherit controllers is the compiler will generate constructors here whose signature matches the constructors in your parent, and that's not what we want here.
Because we got to pass it to the super, not use the same one. Okay.
Yep. Yeah, I didn't repeat the question. The question was, could you use inherit controllers to, so you didn't have to author the inherit constructors, so you don't have to author a constructor here, and I think the answer to that is probably no. Was there any other questions? Yeah.
If you get a validation error during the save, how would you generate JSON error message?
If you get a validation error during save, how would you generate corresponding JSON representation? Is that the question? So when you call respond, you can pass the errors object as an argument, is one piece of that. So you could say, do some stuff with the P here and then validate it. And if P dot has errors, render P dot errors. All right, you can do that. I don't know if there's, I'm sorry, you'd respond with the errors. I don't know that there's anything in the respond method that looks at the thing to see if it has errors. But you can do this. You can respond with the errors. Yeah.
I have a situation where I'm interacting with a third-party JavaScript client that insists upon capitalizing on my get param. Is the best way to handle that through an interceptor or through what you just showed?
You're saying that you're dealing with somebody who insists on HTTP request parameters beginning with uppercase letters?
All of them uppercase.
Well, the whole request parameter name has to be uppercase. And you want to know how to manage, how to still take advantage of the data binding. So one terrible idea would be to name all your properties in that same broken way. So you don't want to do that, of course. What would be a good way to do that? So you can, so one option, as he suggests, is don't do business with them. So one thing you can do there is in your, if you were using a Restful controller, you could override the get object to bind thing, and have some kind of, you have to have some kind of rules for doing the conversions, maybe underscores or where the camel case stuff comes into place. That's one thing you could do. So you've got a number of ways to get there. That might be one piece of the puzzle.
Would it be better to do that or an interceptor, which would be more performant?
Yeah, so it would depend on what all was going on in the control. I guess if you were using an interceptor, you could narrow the interceptor down to only apply to the controller actions where you would need this conversion to take place. That might be a reasonable place to do this. So you could have a before interceptor that only applies to these to the actions where you're concerned about doing this conversion. And in that before interceptor, you could be creating a bunch of additional parameters. You could be adding parameters to the map whose values are the same as the values that were already there, but you're plugging in new keys in the map that are camel case instead of all uppercase. An interceptor is probably a good way to go about that. Yeah.
Would the interceptor know, or because the interceptor still has to know the actual name of the method, it just does not invoke it until it does something.
Yeah, the question is, would the interceptor know about it? And it would, right? So when you define an interceptor, you get to express things like, this interceptor is in play anytime a request comes into these actions. You get to narrow, you get to specify which controllers and which actions the interceptor is applied to. So now when that interceptor is invoked, it knows that it's associated with those actions. That's the only time it would ever be invoked. Yeah, so I think the interceptor has full context of everything it needs there. So what are you thinking about that the interceptor might not have access to there, that it would need?
The actual name of the method. For example, we're looking for update with small case.
Yeah, so yeah, I think I understand now. So no, the interceptor wouldn't need to know the names of any methods, right? We're talking about changing request parameter names, and it wouldn't even have to know about request parameter names. It would just need to know that for when this interceptor is in play, let's iterate through all of the request parameters and have a routine that knows how to turn an uppercase string into a camel case string, maybe looking for underscores or so forth. So there wouldn't have to be any hard coding in your interceptor about particular parameter names, certainly not any method names. I think you could get there, as long as you had a reliable pattern for converting your uppercase names to camel case. Now, if they've really gone kind of off the rails and it's just all uppercase with no underbars or anything, and you need to map that to camel case, you're going to have some challenges there, but there's just not enough context to be able to do it.
You can look at the command object, right?
You don't have access to the command object in the interceptor. That hasn't happened yet. The command object doesn't exist yet. But even then, so even if you try to do this in your controller by looking at command object parameter, that's going to get tedious, and yeah, that's going to get a little bit wiry. But if you can get away with the general thing where you just got a routine for turning uppercase names into camel case names, that wouldn't be terribly tedious and certainly would be doable. Yeah. Other questions? Good. All right, that's all for me. I'd like to talk to you about the named converter thing we were talking about. But thank you all very much, and if you need anything from me, please let me know.